The ritual is always the same. It's an anchor in the controlled chaos of my world. The water, nearly boiling, runs over my hands as the hard-bristled brush scrapes my skin from fingertips to elbows. The smell of iodine and antiseptic soap is the perfume of my profession, a scent that long ago replaced any other in my olfactory memory. I have washed my hands this way more than 10,000 times. It is an act of purification, a baptism before entering the sacred temple that is my operating room. And my hands have always been my pride. Steady, precise, infallible. Hands that have held beating hearts, that have sutured arteries the thickness of a thread, that have restored rhythm to lives that were about to fade away. But today, for the first time in years, something is different. As I dry my hands under the sterile white light, I notice a nearly imperceptible tremor in my right pinky finger, a minuscule spasm, a vibration that lasts barely a second, but to me, it feels like an earthquake. I ignore it. I attribute it to the coffee, to a lack of sleep. I am Dr. Samuel Carter, Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, and my hands do not tremble. They are not allowed to tremble. The operation ahead of me today is not like the others. Technically, it is. It's a standard heart transplant, if such a thing can ever be called standard. But the patient, Arthur Jensen, is on a knife's edge. His end-stage cardiomyopathy has turned his heart into a flaccid, exhausted muscle with an ejection fraction in the single digits. It's a miracle he's still alive, a miracle assisted by the cardiopulmonary bypass machine that, in a few minutes, will become his heart and lungs, while I try to give him a second chance with the organ of an anonymous donor. But there are no guarantees. The odds, being generous, are 50-50. As I walk down the hallway toward the pre-op room, the hum of monitors and the murmur of nurses form a familiar symphony. But beneath that familiarity, I feel a dissonance, a strange off-key note that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It's a premonition, a feeling so alien to my logical, scientific nature that I find it irritating. "Everything's ready, doctor," a nurse informs me, handing me the tablet with Arthur's vitals. I nod, my mind already in the operating room, visualizing every cut, every suture. But as I enter the room, the strange feeling intensifies. Arthur Jensen lies pale on the gurney, a tangle of tubes and wires connecting him to life. But his eyes are open, and they burn with a feverish intensity. It's not the resigned or terrified look I usually see in patients minutes before open-heart surgery. It's something else. It's an urgency. Then, as if my premonition had been a prologue to this precise moment, Arthur looks directly at me. "Dr. Carter." His voice is a deep, broken whisper, as if each word were a stone he had to drag up from the bottom of his exhausted lungs. I move closer, expecting the last-minute question, the request to look after his family. "Before you start," he says, his knuckles turning white as he grips the bed rail. "Before you do this to me, there's something I have to tell you. If something happens to me, if I don't survive, I want someone to know. It's something I've never told anyone." His words catch me off guard. I stand in silence for a moment, aware of the anesthesiologist waiting for my signal at the door. What could be so important to say now? Why at this moment when every second counts, when his life depends on my absolute focus? "I don't want to die with this secret," he whispers, and his eyes fill with tears. I look at his hand on my arm, then at his face. Protocol, logic, the clock. Everything is screaming at me to ignore him, to call the nurse, to proceed. But the physician in me, the healer who swore not only to mend bodies but to alleviate suffering, stops me. I know that sometimes the weight of the soul is as lethal as the diseased heart. I sigh, defeated by a force older than science. I lean in, bringing my face close to his. The world narrows to just the two of us, the smell of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beep of the pulse monitor. "What is it you need to tell me, Arthur?" He takes a shaky breath, like a man about to jump off a cliff, and then he begins to whisper. As Arthur Jensen's words, barely audible, begin to flow into my ear, the world around me distorts. The rhythmic beep of the monitor seems to slow down, each pulse a heavy echo in a cavern. The sterile smell of the hospital vanishes, replaced by something stale, like damp earth and the metallic scent of rust. His words are not just sounds, they are cold and heavy. I feel them fall inside me, one by one, not into my mind, but into my stomach, sinking like stones in a deep, dark lake. My pulse, which seconds ago was calm and measured, skyrockets. An icy chill runs down my spine, a physical, uncontrollable reaction. I feel the visceral urge to recoil, to pull away from him, but his hand still grips my arm, and I'm frozen in place, an unwilling confessor at the deathbed of a man who is still alive. When he finishes speaking, the silence he leaves is louder than any scream. I pull my head back slowly. The fluorescent light in the room now seems harsher, crueler. I look at my patient, and the frail man I saw before has vanished. In his place, there is a shadow, a darkness that stares back at me from the depths of his eyes. He is no longer Arthur Jensen, patient number 734. He is the protagonist of the horrific story he just poured into my soul. What kind of man was I about to save? My mouth is dry. I swallow, but it's like swallowing dust. The Hippocratic Oath echoes in my mind, a simple, pure maxim. First, do no harm. But what if saving this man would cause a greater harm? What if letting him die was a form of justice? The thought is monstrous, unprofessional, a heresy in the temple of medicine. And yet, there it is, slithering in the back of my mind. If I don't survive, Arthur repeats, his voice now exhausted, empty. Promise me you'll tell my wife. She needs to know who I really was. The words to make the promise get stuck in my throat. Every fiber of my being wants to refuse, to reject this burden, this pact with a ghost. But I look into his eyes and I see that the fear of death has been replaced by something worse. The fear of dying unknown, without his truth, however terrible, coming to light. If you don't survive, I say, and my own voice sounds hollow, distant. I'll tell them. I release his grip from my arm. I straighten up. My body feels heavy, my movements stiff. I turn and walk toward the door without looking back. Dr. Carter, are you all right? You're pale, says the anesthesiologist. I'm fine, I reply, and the lie tastes like ash. Let's proceed. The operating room doors swing open with a pneumatic hiss. As I step into the cold, bright room, under the powerful lights that forgive no shadows, I feel the doors close behind me, sealing me inside, sealing me in with him, and with his secret. The outside world vanishes the moment the operating room doors close behind me. In here, the universe is governed by other laws. Time is not measured in hours, but in the rhythmic beeps of the monitors. The air smells of nothing and everything at once, of ozone, of sterilized metal, and of the palpable tension of lives in the balance. My team moves around me with a quiet efficiency, a choreography rehearsed thousands of times. They are the best, and they trust me implicitly. Today, for the first time, I feel that trust is a sham. I position myself over Arthur Jensen. His body, draped in surgical blue, no longer seems human. It is a battlefield, a geography of iodine-painted skin awaiting my intervention. The overhead lights are so intense they erase all shadows, exposing everything. But they cannot expose the secret now nesting inside me, a darkness no light can penetrate. Scalpel, please. My voice sounds unnervingly normal, an echo of the authority I have always projected. The nurse places the cold metal in my palm. It feels heavier than usual. Every surgeon has a pact with their patient, a pact of blind trust. The patient entrusts us with their life, and we entrust them with our skill and our absolute judgment. But Arthur, he broke that pact before I made the first incision. He didn't entrust me with his life. He entrusted me with his guilt. And now, that guilt is mine as well. The blade glides over the skin of Arthur's chest, opening a perfect red line. The incision is flawless, an act of muscle memory. My hands know what to do. The problem is my mind. As I cut through the layers of skin and muscle, Arthur's secret beats in my head, louder than the heart I am about to stop. Sternal saw. The high-pitched buzz of the saw fills the room as I cut through the sternum. The vibration travels up my arms. It is a brutal act, a necessary violence to reach the sanctuary of the heart. I have always hated this sound, but today it seems particularly grotesque. I am forcing open a man's chest, not only to repair an organ, but to rummage in the nest of his crime. With the chest open, Arthur's heart is exposed. It is a sad organ, pale and dilated, struggling weakly for each beat. As my team works with astonishing precision to connect Arthur to the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, I can't stop looking at that heart. The heart that was beating frantically in the chest of a scared, guilty young man 25 years ago on a dark highway. Initiating cardiopulmonary bypass. The anesthesiologist announces the critical moment. Arthur's blood begins to divert from his body, flowing through clear tubes to the machine that now breathes and pumps for him. His heart at last can rest, and I, at last, can stop it. I inject the potassium solution directly into the aorta. The cardiac muscle quivers one last time and then falls still. The monitor that marked his pulse now shows a flat line. A profound silence falls over the room, broken only by the soft whir of the machine. Arthur Jensen is now in a limbo, neither alive nor dead, sustained entirely by technology and my hands. The time comes to remove the diseased organ. I cut the great arteries and veins, freeing the heart from its tethers. I lift it and hold it in my gloved hand. It is an exhausted muscle, gray, heavy, and for an instant I don't see cardiac tissue. I see a dark, rain-soaked highway, the flash of headlights on wet asphalt. I hear the sharp, sickening sound of shattering glass and twisting metal. I see a mangled bicycle, its front wheels spinning uselessly in the air, and above all I feel the silence that comes after the impact, a heavy, guilty silence, the silence of a stolen life and a coward fleeing into the darkness. "Heart is out," I announce, my voice hoarse. I place Arthur's organ on a metal tray with a dull thud. My patient's chest is now an empty chasm. The nurse approaches with the new heart. It floats in a preservation solution inside a sterile bag. It is the heart of a young, healthy donor, an anonymous gift of life. I take it in my hands. Unlike Arthur's, this one is firm, pink, vibrant with the potential that was cut short. It's an organ full of promise, of unlived beats, and I am about to place it in the chest of a man whose own promise was broken on a rainy highway a quarter of a century ago. Here I am, with one man's life on a tray and another's death in my mind. Is this an act of healing, or am I about to commit the greatest mistake of my career? Am I transplanting an organ or laundering a rotten soul? My hand, my right hand, the one holding the suture needle, hesitates for a fraction of a second. No one notices, but I feel it. I feel the weight of the scales of justice, and I don't know which pan I am placing this heart on. "Dr. Carter, everything okay?" my assistant asks, noticing my pause. "Yes," I lie. "Let's proceed with the aortic anastomosis." I begin to suture. My fingers move on instinct, weaving the delicate dance of needle and thread, connecting the great vessels of the new heart to Arthur's. Stitch by stitch, my hands perform the symphony they have practiced for years, but my mind is a courtroom. Every suture is an argument. "He's a patient, Samuel. Your duty is to him." But what about Daniel Carter, my cousin, who advocated for him on that highway? Saving a life is an absolute good without conditions. Even the life of a murderer? The procedure advances. The connections are almost complete. Everything is going too well. A strange calm before the storm I feel is coming. "Aortic cross-clamp removed, preparing for reperfusion," I announce. This is the moment of truth, the moment when Arthur's blood will flow back into the new heart, asking it to awaken. Warm red blood floods the coronary arteries. The muscle, pale from ischemia, regains its pink color. All eyes are on the monitor. We wait for a rhythm, a beat. And then it happens. The heart doesn't beat. It enters ventricular fibrillation. It writhes in Arthur's chest like a bag of worms. a chaotic, useless tremor that doesn't pump a single drop of blood. The rhythmic beep of the monitor turns into a shrill, continuous alarm that pierces the quiet of the operating room. "He's in VFib," someone shouts. Controlled chaos erupts. "Get the paddles. Charge to 20, I order, my voice sharper than usual. My mind, however, is not on the protocol. It's on the secret. It's as if the universe is resisting. As if this new heart, the heart of an innocent young person, refuses to beat in the chest of a guilty man. It's his body, his soul, rejecting this second chance he doesn't deserve. The complication doesn't feel medical. It feels karmic. Clear. Arthur's body jumps on the table from the impact of the electric shock. My eyes are glued to the monitor. Nothing. The chaotic tracing continues. The heart is still trembling uselessly. Desperation begins to seep into the room. I look at Arthur's open chest, at the heart that refuses to live, and the weight of my judgment crushes me. My anger, my disgust at this man's secret, my conflict. It is all here in this room, poisoning the air, interfering with my ability. I realize my internal conflict is actively endangering my patient. Enough. The thought is as clear and sharp as a scalpel. I am not his judge. I am not his executioner. I am not his confessor. I am his surgeon. And my only duty in this universe, at this precise instant, is this heartbeat. Nothing else matters. Clarity floods me. The noise in my mind falls silent. Only the protocol remains. Charge to 30, I command, and my voice is now that of the Dr. Carter everyone knows. Steady, calm, in absolute control. Clear. Another shock jolts Arthur's body. An agonizing silence takes hold of the room. We all hold our breath, our eyes fixed on the erratic line of the monitor. And then, a blip, a QRS complex, an orderly spike, a pause, another, and another. The shrill alarm is replaced by a slow, spaced, but perfectly regular beep. Sinus rhythm. The heart is beating. On its own, strong and steady. A collective sigh of relief ripples through the operating room. The tension breaks. My assistant looks at me and nods, his eyes full of relief and admiration. I don't feel relief. I feel an immense emptiness. I finish the surgery. My hands are steady again. I close the chest, wire the sternum back together, suture the skin. I have done my job. I have saved Arthur Jensen's life. But as I make the final stitch, I know that even though the surgery is over, my own ordeal has just begun. I have enclosed the new heart in his chest, but Arthur's secret is now free, and it is waiting for me outside the operating room doors. The hours that followed the surgery blend into a fog of exhaustion and a strange, vibrant anxiety. The procedure was officially a success, a textbook success. My colleagues patted me on the back. The residents looked at me with their usual admiration, and the ICU nurses informed me with tired smiles that Arthur Jensen's vitals were stable. "Brilliant work, Sam," Dr. Peterson, the chief of staff, told me. "Few surgeons would have pulled him out of that fibrillation." I just nodded, my mouth forming the words of thanks automatically, while my mind was miles away, trapped on a rainy highway 25 years ago. I spent the night at the hospital. Not because Arthur was in immediate danger, but because the idea of going home, to my silent, orderly apartment, seemed unbearable. The silence there would be different. It would be a silence filled with Arthur's inaudible whisper, a void I would fill myself with the words of his confession. At least here, the constant beeping of monitors and the comings and goings of the night staff kept the worst thoughts at bay. I sat in my office, the glass door looking out onto the deserted hallway. The cup of coffee on my desk had been cold for hours. On my computer screen, I had Arthur's medical history open, a lifetime of clinical data that said nothing of the truth. Cholesterol, blood pressure, allergies. Where was the section for the sins of the soul, for unpunished crimes? The promise I made to him burned in my mind. If you don't survive, I'll tell them. A conditional promise. And he had survived. My hands had ensured it. Technically, my obligation was void. I could erase the conversation from my memory, file it away as the delusion of a terrified man on the brink of death. I could and I should. It was my professional duty to maintain distance, to protect patient confidentiality, to go back to being Dr. Samuel Carter, the precision mechanic of broken hearts. But I couldn't. The secret wasn't a piece of information to be filed. It was a virus. It had infected my judgment, my peace, my very perception of my work. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see sutures or arteries. I saw Arthur's face, distorted by fear and guilt. The secret didn't belong to me, but now it lived inside me. It was around 3 a.m, in that dead hour when the world seems to hold its breath, that I couldn't take it anymore. The need to know, to confirm that I hadn't imagined the monstrosity of his confession, was an itch in my brain I had to scratch. I turned to my computer, closed the medical history, and opened the web browser. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I felt like a traitor, violating a sacred trust. But a greater force compelled me. And then, the exact words, the ones I had tried to suppress for hours with surgical reports and data analysis, emerged from the back of my memory, as clear and cruel as if he were whispering them again in my ear, right here, in the stillness of my office. Doctor, 25 years ago, on the Clayton County Road. It was October, raining cats and dogs. I was young, stupid, and I was drunk, driving too fast. I didn't see the kid on the bike until it was too late. The impact. God, the sound, like hitting a large animal. I stopped for a second. I saw him in the rearview mirror, just a dark shape on the asphalt. Panic flooded me. I was a coward. I sped up. I left him there. I left him to die alone on the road in the rain. The next day, I sold the car. A few weeks later, I moved away, started a new life, got married, had kids, pretended to be a good man. But that face, the one I saw in the newspaper days later, it has never left me. Not for a single night in 25 years. My fingers trembled as I typed the words into the search bar. Cyclist accident, Clayton County, 1999. The results appeared instantly. The first was a link to the digitized archives of the Clayton County Chronicle, the local newspaper. The headline was cold and impersonal. Young cyclist killed in hit and run. Police seek witnesses. I clicked. The page loaded slowly, each second a torment. A scanned article appeared, the text slightly blurry, accompanied by a low-resolution black and white photograph. It wasn't a picture of the accident, but of the location. An empty, wet country road, flanked by dark trees. The article described the facts sparsely. A young man found by a driver early in the morning. Death by massive trauma. The bicycle, a 10-speed Schwinn, found mangled in a ditch. The police asked for the public's help in finding a dark sedan with front-end damage on the right side. There were no witnesses. The case was never solved. I read the quotes from the sheriff at the time, talking about an unforgivable act of cowardice. I read the pleas of the parents, begging for anyone with information to come forward. And then I reached the end of the article. The name of the victim. My heart, the one I kept so healthy and strong, did a violent lurch that left me breathless. The victim was Daniel Carter, age 18. Carter. The same last name, my last name. A cold sweat broke out on my back. It couldn't be. It was a common name, a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. But my mind, trained to find patterns, to connect the dots, refused to accept chance. I started a new, frantic search, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Daniel Carter, Clayton County, obituary, 1999. I found an obituary on a local funeral home's page. It spoke of a brilliant young man, captain of his high school's debate team, accepted to Johns Hopkins University to study medicine. A young man who dreamed of being a surgeon. A young man loved by his parents, John and Helen Carter. Helen Carter, my father's cousin. The air escaped my lungs in a hiss. The world tilted on its axis. The story was no longer a newspaper article. It was a memory, a blurry memory from my childhood. I was about 10 years old. I remember my parents talking in whispers in the kitchen about the terrible tragedy with Helen's son, an accident, a drunk driver who was never found. I remember the sadness in my father's voice. a distant grief for a branch of the family we rarely saw. To me, back then, it was just a sad, grown-up story. Now the story had risen from the grave of my memory and sat before me with the pale face and pleading eyes of Arthur Jensen. The man whose life I had just saved with my own hands was my cousin's killer. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence of the office. The irony was so monstrous, so cosmically cruel, it was almost poetic. The universe hadn't just made me the confessor to a killer. It had made me his savior, and it had intertwined his crime with the blood of my own family. The promise I made to Arthur was no longer a matter of professional ethics. It had become a matter of family loyalty, of justice, of a twisted fate that had placed me at the center of a drama that had been waiting 25 years for its final act. The question was no longer what I should do. The question was what I could possibly do. The secret was no longer Arthur's. Now it was mine too. The following days became an exercise in professional dissociation. During my rounds, I would enter Arthur Jensen's room, read his vitals on the monitor, listen to his new heart beating strong and steady through my stethoscope, and nod at his progress. I kept my interactions brief, clinical, shielded by medical jargon and a barrier of professionalism that had never felt so fragile. Arthur, for his part, was improving at a remarkable rate. The color was returning to his cheeks. His breathing was deeper. A new, strong heart, an organ that symbolically represented everything that had been stolen from Daniel Carter, was giving him a new life. Every time I saw him smile weakly at a nurse or talk to his wife on the phone, a wave of nausea rose in my throat. I saw a murderer recovering in a hospital bed, being cared for by his victim's cousin. The irony was a poison spreading slowly through my veins. I avoided being alone with him, but I knew the confrontation was inevitable. There was an unasked question hanging in the air every time our eyes met. He had given me his secret. I had given him a new heart. We were two men bound by a terrible pact, and the silence could not last forever. A week after the surgery, I found him sitting in an armchair by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. His recovery was astonishing. I approached, my white coat making a soft sound in the quiet of the room. "You're looking much better, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding strangely serene. He turned. The gratitude on his face was so pure, so overwhelming, that I felt a pang of something like compassion, which only enraged me further. "It's thanks to you, doctor," he said hoarsely. You've given me something I don't deserve, a second chance." His words opened the door, and I, who had spent days wrestling with my conscience, decided to walk through it. "Sometimes, second chances come with conditions, Arthur," I replied, moving to the window and watching the rain with him, the same rain that fell on the Clayton County road 25 years ago. I felt his gaze on me, a mix of confusion and a dawning dread. "Conditions?" he asked. "I did what you asked me to," I continued, my voice low and controlled. "I looked into it, about an old accident in Clayton County, a hit and run on a rainy night in 1999. The color drained from Arthur's face. The healthy flush that his new heart had given him vanished, leaving him with a waxy pallor, the same one he'd had on the gurney before surgery. His breathing became shallow. For a moment I feared the stress might damage the work my hands had done. "The young cyclist was named Daniel Carter," I said, finally turning to meet his eyes. "He was 18. He had his whole life ahead of him." Arthur didn't answer. He just stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the collapse of a man who had spent 25 years building a wall around his secret, and I, his savior, had just demolished it with a single sentence. "Carter," he whispered, and the word broke on his lips. "Was he—" "My cousin," I finished for him. "My father's cousin's son." The silence that followed was absolute. A universe of pain, guilt, and a coincidence so monstrous it defied all logic hung between us. I saw tears begin to well up in his eyes, silent tears that rolled down the wrinkles of a face that had aged a decade in the last minute. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to justify himself. He simply crumbled. His body shook with silent sobs, the sound of a soul finally breaking. The new heart, Daniel's symbolic heart, beat strongly in his chest, pumping life through a man consumed by the death he had caused. I stood there, watching him, the fire of my anger, the thirst for justice, the confusion. It all dissolved, leaving only an immense, exhausting emptiness. What was I supposed to do now? Call the police? Destroy the life I had just saved? Or carry this secret to my grave, becoming his accomplice? I left the room without another word. The next few days were a personal hell. Arthur was discharged. He went home to his family with my cousin's stolen chance at life beating in his chest. And I was left with the knowledge of his crime, a weight that contaminated every aspect of my life. My hands, once my pride, now felt unclean. Every life I saved seemed like a mockery of the life he had stolen. The promise I'd made had become my damnation. Months passed. Autumn gave way to a cold, gray winter. I tried to forget, to immerse myself in work, but the face of Daniel Carter from that old obituary haunted me. And the face of Arthur, broken by guilt, did too. One night in February, as I was watching the local news without paying attention, a story pulled me from my stupor. A reporter, standing in front of the Clayton County Sheriff's Office, was talking about an unexpected break in a cold case from more than 25 years ago. Police sources confirm, the reporter said, that the hit-and-run case of Daniel Carter has now been closed, thanks to the voluntary confession of a man named Arthur Jensen, who turned himself in this morning. The camera showed Arthur getting out of a car, his face calm, almost serene, as two officers escorted him into the building. He didn't look like a man being arrested. He looked like a man being set free. I turned off the television. The silence in my apartment was no longer threatening. It was quiet. I got up and went to the window, looking out at the city lights. I understood that my job hadn't ended when I closed Arthur's chest. It had continued in silence, in the confrontation in that hospital room. By giving him a new heart, I hadn't just given him an organ. I had given him a conscience. I had transplanted the opportunity for redemption. I looked at my hands in the moonlight. They no longer felt unclean. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger or guilt. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt peace. Justice sometimes doesn't come through punishment, but through healing. And healing sometimes requires a transplant. I hadn't just repaired a body. I had provided the chance to repair a soul. And in that act, without realizing it, I had also begun to heal my own.